The proceeding is currently...
Thank you very much. Second panel, let me quickly ask you to introduce yourselves because we are now pressed for time if there is this vote. Romilly, I'm going to start with you by saying you have been in front of this panel on many occasions, but you have changed jobs since we've seen you, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And you know, tell us who you are and who your new organisation is, please.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm Romilly Greenhill. I am the new CEO of Bond, which is the UK NGO network. We have 380 members working in the development space in the UK.
Evie, let me come to you. Welcome. Tell us who you are and who you're representing.
Hi, I'm Evie Aspinall. I'm the director of the British Foreign Policy Group. We're a not-for-profit, non-partisan think tank focused on the intersection between domestic and foreign policy.
Thank you very much. And Ian, also a friend of this committee, introduce yourself and your organisation, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'm Ian Mitchell. I'm co-director of the Europe programme of the Centre for Global Development, which is a think tank in London and Washington.
Thank you very much. Andrew, over to you.
David, how has the way that the FCDO has delivered development aid transformed over recent years, particularly following the cuts to the ODA budget?
So I think here the key distinction is between what the Foreign Office has said it will do and what has practically happened since the cuts. So a number of key trends we've seen as a result of the cuts. One has been regional. So almost all countries have seen large reductions in aid from 2020 to 2022. However, Africa has particularly lost out, not least because of aid to Ukraine following Russia's invasion. We've seen a shift despite plans to move towards bilateral aid, towards multilateral aid, and a key part of this has been the shift towards non-grant development finance, which we're here to discuss today. In part, that's driven by the economic situation, so the aim being that non-grant development finance can allow us to unlock more money and do more with less. There's also a drive towards localisation and local project delivery, empowering local businesses and organisations by giving them the capital they need to get started. This, in turn, has precipitated a number of other shifts. One is, and contrary to kind of what our aims and objectives have been stated in kind of the recent white paper and in the integrated review refresh, is that we've shifted away from some of the lower income countries towards more mature markets because there is less perceived risk in investments in those areas. Similarly, we've seen a move away from poverty alleviation as a priority, particularly when we're looking at non-grant development finance.
Does that surprise you, the move away from poverty?
I think it does in terms of instead of our stated objectives, it doesn't align with what we kind of have said our vision for the world should be and what our role we want to play in it. It's not necessarily surprising, particularly on the non-grant development finance, because it's quite inherent in the model. It's easier to encourage private capital when there's less risk involved. So they will always go for those easier opportunities, which tend to be in middle income countries, and that's one of the big things that we need to focus on, is find ways to implement guardrails that make sure that we do prioritise lower income countries still.
Ian, can I start with you, please? I think you heard the previous session, didn't you, where we were talking about the finance gap and the need to find alternative forms of finance to bridge it. So is that a direction of travel that you agree with?
I think when we've looked at this, we've seen that there's a lot of aspiration for private finance to fill the financing gap. But I think when you look at the actual record of the instruments that are used, the multiples are not very huge and not very large. The billions to trillions mantra of a decade ago has shown to have failed. Most of the instruments we looked at were able, for every pound of public money, there was between 50p and £1.50 of private money being mobilised. So some movement of private money, but relatively incremental. So I think the private mobilisation agenda, is an important part of the development approach that we need. Lower income countries need a financial sector that operates, but I think that the conclusion that there's a huge financing gap and therefore we need to mobilise private money with public money is not going to lead us very far.
What's the reason for that? Is it that there's just not schemes out there that are attractive to investors, so that you can't attract investment?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think in a sense, development is about capital moving into economies so that they can grow. And when the institutions and the conditions are sound in a country, then the private market has a very strong interest in moving in and investing. And I think that the question of whether public money is best spent on strengthening the institutions and the public sector of that country, or whether it's used to slightly increase, the returns or decrease the risk, I think that it's valuable to have a balance of both. But on the whole, I think it's the former that matters more to private money moving into lower income countries, and a little bit of subsidy isn't going to make a great difference if you're a private investor looking at one of those countries. It's not transformational having a slightly lower risk because of some insurance from government.
Sounds like we're in danger of billions to trillions becoming billions to millions, which is probably not quite what we're after, is it? When we looked at BII, we sort of had a long look at what additionality meant and how you could ensure you were being additional rather than just almost crowding out what private finance was there because it was a way of getting a return. Does this work? Have we got development institutions actually doing stuff that other people won't, or are they just doing stuff that other people might have done because that's probably the easiest way of doing the work we're asking them to do? Evie, any?
I think it's honestly quite hard to assess because it's actually very hard to pinpoint additionality and show exactly, whenever you talk to counterfactuals, it's very hard to assess whether it would have been there in the first place. But what we have seen is that consistently what many of these instruments are doing are investing in low risk options because that's how you can mobilise the private capital. So it's because there's multiple kind of levers trying to pull them in the same places at the same time, you find that they then invest in the low risk options, which actually that's where private capital would invest in the first place. The challenge is therefore we have to move to the higher risk options if we actually want to be saying we're genuinely doing an additionality. The danger is obviously that's spending, that's money, is investment, but to be seen to risk public money is a dangerous narrative to go down. So they've got that kind of constant battle of wanting to keep their credit ratings, not wanting to take too much risk, but that's when you actually are achieving additionality.
It's slightly perverse, isn't it? Because we're moving money that we're literally just spending on good things to investing on what we hope will produce good things, and then we're worrying that we might lose the money that we would otherwise have just spent and not got back. It's not the most logical of... in reality, we shouldn't be expecting successful returns on every investment, and we shouldn't be too upset if quite a few of these go wrong, should we? But Romilly, do you have any views on this topic?
So I agree with everything that colleagues have said, and actually one of our concerns with BII is it isn't investing enough in least developed countries. So our analysis showed over the last 5 years only 21% by value was going into the least developed countries. So I very much agree with what Evie is saying. If we're genuinely putting in public money into BII, we would want it to be in the riskier environments, the fragile states, the LDCs, and also in the more difficult sectors. One of our big concerns around BII is around climate. We're not seeing the levels of commitment around climate investments in renewable energy and so on that we'd want to be seeing. So really we would like BII to be doing things that private sector money isn't doing in riskier environments and in more inclusive, gender-sensitive, climate-smart sectors.
We've struggled to get our own pension schemes to invest in our own infrastructure and high-risk businesses. Do you see much appetite for pension schemes investing in African infrastructure and high-risk investments?
No, and I think, again, to double tap on Ian's point, there's also a question of, is this the best use of our ODA money? Actually getting the regulatory environment right and getting the rule of law right and all the kind of fundamentals right in some of these countries. And actually, by the way, you can use a bit of ODA to do that, and I think that's quite a sensible use of money. But this idea of sort of small amounts of public money catalysing large amounts of private money, we've tried it now for more than a decade, and I don't think the evidence base is really there. And I think what bond members are really concerned about as well is there are real trade-offs with the rest of the ODA budget. As we all know, the budget's been cut from 0.7 to 0.5. There's the refugee spending, so in fact the ODA budget's more like 0.3 at the moment, and actually a growing share of that is going into BII. And we're therefore seeing cuts to girls' education, health, and food security, etc., etc.
Romilly, so this session is about looking at alternative sources of financing. So with that pretty bleak that you painted, where are the alternatives? I mean, what ought to be happening? What do your members say would be, why isn't the government doing this rather than...
So I think there's a lot we can do on public sources of financing, actually. So the multilateral development banks, getting bigger, better, more transparent, better governed, more equitable banks, greener banks, that is a really important area. I think actually the current government is doing a fair amount on that, which is welcome. I think actually looking at things like global taxation, we haven't seen enough progress on that. I think that's a really important area. Things like illicit financial flows, how can we tap down on...
Just say a bit more about what you mean about by global taxation.
Well, at the moment, things like, airline taxes, we don't properly tax aviation fuel, and we should do that. That would also be very good for the climate, and it would generate new resources, public resources, that we could use for development. Helping countries also to raise more of their own tax revenues by cracking down on things like tax havens and so on. Incredibly important, and that's public money that could really be used to fight poverty and invest in infrastructure and so on.
Thank you. Romilly, I was going to ask you, do you think there's sufficient... Oh, sorry, I have to go back to Evie on my question ahead of myself. Many of the SCDO's British investment partnerships are partnered with or jointly funded by other governments and organisations. Can you tell me, does this limit the leverage that the SCDO has within these financial instruments?
It's the classic problem of kind of collaboration versus competition. I think so. There is a risk that when you're all operating in the same markets, that you end up competing with each other. This is, I think, a particular challenge in lower income countries where the opportunities to invest are smaller and there are fewer. And what we actually find is that we are competing rather than supporting each other. There's also a risk of duplication, which, given as we all know how tight budgets are, that's kind of one we want to mitigate. I do think there's also opportunities though to collaborate with partners. And I think that's an approach we're trying to do in general in our foreign policy, and we should encourage. Not least that different investment organisations have different specialist expertise and skills and offer differing financing options. And so collectively we can work together to make a better package, which can also help mitigate some of the risks. That's certainly a positive. So there are risks, but actually there are opportunities as well.
Okay. And can you tell me how effective is the injection of new capital in instruments such as BII, PIDG, and of course Mobilist, and achieving the SCDO's international development objectively, particularly given obviously its increasingly limited ODA budget?
So how effective they've been in general? A mixed success, and partly it's because, as we heard from the first panel, each is doing quite different things and working in different ways. They've been somewhat effective. I think the biggest challenge, as I alluded to earlier, was that they aren't always completely aligned with our development objectives, and not least because lots of the investments are legacy investments that are ongoing, so they're not what our current objectives are, which have also shifted and changed. So as Romilly mentioned, things like climate, we haven't seen enough investment in. We've not seen enough investment in lower income countries. So whilst their broad objectives are in line with what kind of the broader development sectors are, they aren't intricately, and crucially they're not being held particularly accountable, and there's a big issue around transparency, which I'm sure we'll get into, which means that we can't actually assess how well they are doing against a lot of this criteria.
Feels like a big tanker trying to turn at sea with no rudder at the back. It's quite interesting. And Ian, can you tell me, are the risks involved with these financial instruments often operating in similar sectors and regions? It sounds like it clearly is.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have slightly different areas of focus, and our work looked, I think some of the instruments within British investment partnerships are focused in different areas. So PIDG, for example, who you spoke to in the last session, are more focused in lower income countries than some of the other instruments, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. But as Evie said at the start, the nature of these types of finance means they're typically more towards middle income countries than the FCDO budget is in general. I just also wanted to say, I think there are some other ways to mobilise finance that we saw in our work, and guarantees, I think, is one good example of that. So over the past few years, the government has guaranteed parts of multilateral development banks' portfolios, allowing them to lend quite substantial sums quite quickly, including to Ukraine, but also for climate projects in India and Indonesia and South Africa. And those are quite promising. They aren't likely to call on ODA. And really they're taking advantage of the fact that there's assets on multilateral development balance sheets that can be leveraged. They're almost kind of proof of concept of the reforms that are being pursued. And so that has generated, billions in lending to those countries at relatively low risk.
It was those guarantees that actually started us down this inquiry, because I can't remember, but exponentially the amount that the government has been lending is going up like a rocket, which is fine. Guaranteeing, sorry. Which is fine until, as is predicted, there are one or two big incidents around the world at the same time, which leaves us very overexposed. Do you share any of those concerns?
Well, I think the government could be a lot clearer on how it perceives those risks, because, as you say, if those guarantees are called, they do become ODA, and the government's responsible for fulfilling the loan repayments to those different countries. I think for the loans to Ukraine, I think that's obviously a clear risk, but I guess the alternative was to fund Ukraine directly, and so in this sense it allowed the money to move out the door very quickly. I think the other guarantees are much, much lower risk, because they're through the multilateral banks, and because basically the multilateral banks are not taking enough risk. So I think the chances of those going wrong are much smaller, and therefore they make good sense. But I think it's quite hard to know. The India Green Guarantee is a good example of sort of the lack of transparency. It was announced in COP, Parliament were informed 2 months later, and then we still really haven't heard any detail about what that guarantee is funding. I think in the autumn there was a little bit more detail from the bank, but there must be an expected cost of that guarantee. We know the length of time, we should know what the expected cost is, but that information isn't systematically made available. Sweden have an annual report.
Why is it not made available? I mean, it's leading on my next question. How do we get access to this information?
Yeah, there was some more information in this year's FCDO annual report, so there was an improvement. But I think CEDA have a systematic reporting system where they say these are all our contingent liabilities. This is what we expect them to cost based on the risk that we're taking, and this is the objective of what the guarantee is for. And I think we really need that, because it's around $5 billion that has been guaranteed in the past 2 years.
From 22 to 23, it's gone up 411%, the size of the guarantees.
Which will concern lots of us. Romilly, I guess I'm going to ask a question around this. Do you think there's sufficient information available to let ourselves, politicians, obviously civil society, scrutinise these institutions effectively? And I guess, how can this information be improved to enhance future scrutiny?
So, simple answer to the first part of your question, no. And I think Ian has provided an example. But also on BII, so Publish What You Fund, who assess a lot of different agencies based on transparency, they gave them a score of 26.5 out of 100, which isn't very good, and put them in the bottom half of all of the DFIs. So, I mean, that's a very... Again. 26.5 out of 100. On the Publish What You Fund ranking. I'm sure we can send you this. So they ranked all the different DFIs, and that was the score they gave them.
So would you recommend that there should be a member of government on the board? Because this has come up repeatedly in our committee, and when we've had Andrew Mitchell most recently, he was absolutely adamant that shouldn't be the case. What's your own thoughts on that?
No, I think you need to have much more stronger government control over BII. And I think, to pick up on Evie's point, the government has a set of commitments on climate. It's committed to the SDGs, gender, leave no one behind, all of these agendas. But because BII is at arm's length, it has limited control over how much BII is doing to implement those commitments. So I think the transparency is incredibly important. I personally would like to see an overall strategy for the UK actually across all of the British investment partnerships. What are they trying to achieve? How does it align with the SDGs? More transparency about how much is being spent, to your point, on guarantees, and then actually would enable you, us, people in low-income countries to scrutinise and actually check progress, and that just isn't there at the moment.
Member government on the boards.
Yes, and government on the board, exactly. Yeah.
Rather reverse my tank onto your lawn. I apologise, but over to you.
Right, all right. Mr. Mitchell, you said earlier that when we were discussing the billions to trillions point not having really come to fruition, that the evidence that some extra insurance promoted a big flow of extra private capital was unconvincing, or I can't remember the exact words you used, but I'm not misrepresenting what you said. But aren't guarantees, which you said were quite promising, essentially a form of insurance? Isn't that what they are?
Yeah, I think that they are. I think
what
that's
were you
right.
Were you referring to something different?
No, I was referring to exactly to guarantee. No, I was referring to my broader comment relates to exactly as you said. Will a small amount of public finance cause private finance to flow? You're right. So guarantees are an example of that. I think the way the EU government has used them has been to guarantee loans from multilateral development banks. And for that particular reason, they've been able to move a lot of money, either because the multilateral development bank had reached its country limit, as was the case, I think, with India, or because it enables the African Development Bank, for example, to have a portfolio of lending that it wouldn't otherwise be able to have. And essentially, because the multilateral development banks have such strong balance sheets and those guarantees are unlocking them, I think it's that particular feature that means that they work well.
So, yeah, you would be, I mean, there's been, as the Chair said, there's been a huge increase in the amount of guaranteeing going on. There are obviously some benefits to it. There are obviously some risks. How would you characterise the risks of doing far, far more guaranteeing in the way that we now are doing, compared with the benefits?
And I think there's always... The way the government accounts for these guarantees is there's an expected cost that goes into the FCDO's resource budget, and so that is a real economic cost that's recognised as
when you say an economic
spending.
Cost, you mean the fair value that they put?
That's right. Exactly.
That's not necessarily an actual cost of cash out the door, is it? It's
no, exactly.
It's an accountant's assessment of what the risk is, which may or may not come to fruition, if fruition is the right word for risk crystallising. In the Foreign Office resource accounts, there are quite widely varying risks. So the African Development Bank you mentioned, we guaranteed 1,295 million to 1.3 billion, and the fair value of that is 98 million, or 7.5%. But in Jordan, we guaranteed 252 million at a fair value cost in the accounts of 15 million, or 5.9%. In Iraq, it's 11.7%, 45 million fair value out of 382 million. You used to work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. You're used to crunching numbers in the spreadsheet until you get the number you want. Sorry, I didn't say that. Until you get a reasonable number that could stand scrutiny. How are these numbers calculated?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that, and I think it's exactly the question we should be asking about, because I think it's there's a new report by the government which sets out contingent liabilities, but it doesn't cover these loans because it's not up to date enough. But it on the ones that it does cost, it talks about essentially the creditworthiness of those partner countries and the likelihood of them being unable to repay their loans. I think the guarantees that we've seen that are development related, we haven't seen that breakdown of the probability of not repaying, how it takes into account the different factors.
Those numbers must be behind in order to come
exactly.
up with
this. So someone in the Treasury is calculating those, but the calculations are not available publicly.
So do you know what's wrong with Gibraltar at 25%? 108 million fair value for 425 million of loan. Is there something we're not being told?
Yeah, I don't know about the Gibraltar case. I think probably that's not a multilateral development bank guarantee like the others. So it probably reflects the direct credit risk of that country's.
On the subject of multilateral development bank guarantees, you're saying most of these guarantees are in the form of guarantees to multilateral development banks in order to unlock the heft in their balance sheets. But isn't it also true that didn't we learn this in the financial crisis, that just by accumulating lots of risks into one big risk that's so big that nothing can't possibly go wrong is actually potentially a gargantuan error? That's exactly what we saw in the financial crash, wasn't it?
Yeah, certainly in the private sector we saw that. I think the multilateral development banks are in a different situation where they're overly cautious. They've got extremely strong credit ratings, and different think tanks and my colleagues have said that those balance sheets can be leveraged more. They can issue bonds and borrow in private markets to a greater extent without putting their credit rating at threat.
Because they're quasi-sovereigns.
And then that's right, but exactly, because their repayments are prioritised above private lenders to countries, and they almost always. I think the World Bank has just agreed to publish its detailed information on repayment rates for its loans that will help the private sector make better judgments on that. But it's exactly that reason. If the reform went as far and as fast as some people argue it could, then the opportunity for those guarantees wouldn't exist anymore, because the banks would be taking those risks themselves.
You mean the multilateral?
Exactly.
Would be taking those risks
exactly.
Are there any other big international aid actors who are using these guarantees at the scale that FCDO is using them?
Yeah, perhaps not at the scale of FCDO. I think CEDA and Sweden were probably the first and most active in the use of guarantees. I think one or two other countries have used them as well. But I do think this is, as I said earlier, proof of concept from the UK that there is room on the balance sheets to lend more, and so it is in the vanguard on these issues. It reminds me a little bit of the climate-related debt clauses, where the UK was one of the first to come out and say, look, countries need relief when there's a climate disaster, even though we don't lend ourselves. Beyond the export credits, it was more of a stance of principle, and then now the World Bank has followed that lead, and I do see this as a similar situation.
Yeah. One more question. Going back to what I asked you about at the beginning, the greater degree of insurance that we're seeing is not going to have the transformational effect that people would hope to see. That's what you said earlier. What would have a transformational effect?
So I think if we look at the concessional finance globally, the amount of the G7 and the countries contribute, I think there's probably two main ways you can materially change the amount of finance that's going into development. One is to encourage new countries to contribute, and the climate finance discussions at COP this year will bring that into sharp focus. I think we're seeing some of the Middle Eastern countries contribute more, and that could open the door to a conversation about that. And I think the other is going back to the reform of the multilateral development banks, where potentially there's hundreds, 800 or more than $100 billion that could be unlocked with successful reform, which requires
800 billion?
No, probably between 1 and 500 billion
okay.
additional. On top of 200 billion in aid globally. That needs the support of the shareholders at the banks and a willingness to take more risk. So I think that's a big important agenda. But those are beyond countries stepping up together and providing more ODA. Those, I think, are the only two ways you get significant additional finance into the system.
And we also need greater reassurance. I think Romilly Greenhill mentioned the governance question. There are many jurisdictions where people are reluctant to invest because they think there's going to be a coup d'etat and they'll lose it. To take a slightly different example, this committee was in northern Sinai recently. We met some Gazan businessmen who are now taking refuge in Cairo, but they're looking for lots of investment. Nobody's going to invest in Gaza on the scale required unless there is a political settlement that assures investors that it's not all going to be destroyed by bombs again in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. The same is true of much of Africa and Asia, is it not?
I think there's clearly countries that are either in debt distress or are very fragile and not going to attract private investment. I think the medium-term story for development is much stronger than that. I think if you look at over a 20 or 30-year period, lower-income countries have grown very quickly and are starting to present very good opportunities for investors. And so I think going back to the sort of very beginning of this, is it right that the UK government is supporting financial development in lower-income countries? I think it does make sense to a degree. I think if you think about the UK's comparative advantage, we have a very strong financial sector. Our regulation matters globally, and so I think it's legitimate that the UK should be thinking about policies in that area. And I think the longer-term story of investing in lower-income countries is quite a good one, notwithstanding the fact that there are risks in either of conflict or other challenges for countries. And so I think it's enabling our pension assets and other private investors to access those good returns, as they take off.
Could I direct the same question to both Romilly and Evie, please? I mean, what are alternatives? I mean, Evie, in your introduction, very nicely said, the investment in poverty is dropping dramatically. We're seeing more and more crises around the world, so the problem's only ever going to get bigger. What are the alternatives to us? Romilly or Evie? Well, both of you. That's whoever goes first.
So I think you need to think about sort of domestic, public, private, international, public, private. One of the things on the private sector side, actually, there's a lot of focus about international private finance and FDI and so on. Actually, I think in doing much more to support local private sector in countries, in low and middle income countries, is really important, because actually that's, if you're thinking about the SMEs, MSMEs, that's where actually you get the bigger impacts on gender equality, on poverty reduction, and so encouraging those kind of local markets, I think is really important. On the kind of international public side, so Ian has talked a lot about MDBs, and I agree with everything that you've said there, with a bit more of, actually if we're going to get the MDBs to be fit for purpose, we do need to think about how are they governed, who makes the decisions, the voice of rich countries. All those sorts of issues are incredibly important. So we need bigger banks and we need better banks. On the international side, what I was talking about before in terms of international taxation, things like tackling illicit finance is incredibly important. So I think what we really need to get to is this kind of portfolio approach. The other thing that I think is really important if we're thinking about kind of financing development, public and private money do different things. They have different objectives. If I've got a supermarket on one side of my street and a primary school on the other, you don't really want the public sector running the supermarket, and you don't really want the private sector running universal primary education. So I think sometimes there's this bit of a sort of tendency to sort of mish all the money together and say we haven't got enough public money, therefore we need to bring in the private sector. We need to be really clear about what kinds of money can meet which objectives. So that's the other thing I think we need to think about. And then on the international financial side, yes, there are opportunities, but as we were saying at the beginning, doing more to create the right regulatory environment, make sure that the international private money is also meeting standards on climate, environment, governance, social indicators. I think that's one of the really important things we can be doing, of setting those standards, labour standards, human rights standards, all of those sorts of things, rather than just sort of trying to just sort of get more money in willy-nilly. It's got to be the right kind of money for the right purposes in the right contexts.
And I think the colleagues have spoken to much of the kind of key ones. The MDB point I think is particularly important, reform of MDBs and mobilising a lot of that capital. I think the other things that we could add in is plugging information gaps. One of the biggest challenges for investors is not knowing what's going on in these climates, so the more we can support that. Similarly, investing in local infrastructure for finance, so central banks, etc., providing support for them. I think that's, as was touched on earlier, is kind of a key part of what the UK can offer. And then I think in some ways perhaps you always become a bit pessimistic in these things, and there are, I think, positives about non-grant development finance and opportunities, and not least if we think about transitioning the types of finance we offer. So as countries transition between different stages of development, if we mix the financing that we offer, this should then evolve to reflect the shifting risk configurations. So while we might finance in one way in earlier stages, so using ODA in low-income countries, we can then improve investment climate for private capital to invest as they kind of grow further along. So I think it's not that this is completely irrelevant and not important, and given the size of the financing gap, it does have a role to play. We just need to think strategically to make sure we're using it in the best ways possible.
Do you see other countries doing it better, or are there examples that you think, wow, that's really good, we should replicate it?
I can't think of any immediately, and I don't know if colleagues have of one where you're like, oh, they're brilliant. I think the main things is the ones where nations have thought strategically about their use from the start and thinking about how they align most effectively with your overall development priorities and have the right level of oversight and transparency. And other nations have moved more quickly on the question of transparency, hence why BII is so low.
You don't see that clarity in the white paper?
I don't think so yet. I think there's still more to be done.
Just briefly on that question, Chair. I mean, I think as well, it's hard to know how much the government absolutely wants to be doing this for development reasons, and how much is because it has a financial transactions target from the Treasury. So these are in the spending review. FCDO was given a target for a proportion of its ODA to be used in financial transactions. They can only be used at BII IFC PIDGE. We don't know where that target is now. We don't know what the plans are for spending next year, but the latest public information would suggest that they will need to very substantially increase that spending in the coming financial year, 24-25. The figures are an expected spend of 1.2 billion, which is double what has been spent this year. So
on financial transactions.
Exactly. So
possibly go wrong.
Indeed. So I understand. I mean, I would expect those ongoing negotiations between FCDO and the Treasury, but we're obviously 2 weeks short of the new financial year, and there's certainly no public information that suggests that 1.2 billion won't have to be spent. And FCDO's budget is increasing in 24-25, but only by an amount that means that nearly all of the increase, 2/3 of the increase, will need to be in financial transactions as things stand.
Say that again.
2/3 of the increase in FCDO's budget in 24-25 will need to be in financial transactions.
Meaning of the character of the type we were looking at earlier, funding.
According to the latest public information. Yeah.
Have you done any assessment, any of you, on fees? Because my nostrils always start flaring when I see public money going off on schemes that involve. I'm not saying I'm a recovering banker myself, so I'm not saying I'm against them. But I always think, who is slightly ahead of everyone else? Who's got an edge on this? Who's making a fee, and how big is it? Because you don't get big transactions without fees, and quite often you don't get big transactions without big fees. So if there is an increase in the total of ODA spend that is going into financial transactions, my first thought is, so how much are the fees going up, and for whom? Is this an area that you've looked at all?
It is. I mean, a lot of that will be going into things like BII, PIDGE, and so on. So your earlier questions about sort of financial intermediaries would apply, but that the first recipient of that will be BII, PIDGE, and so on. But just to pick up on Ian's point, I do think there is a sort of tail wagging dog here on some of the financial transactions. It feels like sometimes allocations are being made based on needing to meet those arbitrary targets rather than actually what's the best thing the UK can do to support the SDGs. So to go back to fees, we haven't looked at that. I don't know if colleagues have, but it is quite an interesting question that could be explored.
I mean, I remember it was actually in the Cabinet Office in the UK. The Office of the Third Sector was being hosed money about 15-20 years ago and pleading, don't give us so much, we can't get rid of it quickly enough, and being told no, here it is, you have to have it. And of course there were the predictable disasters that followed. Very interesting, thank you.
Sorry, please.
Can I just maybe check my understanding? Maybe these things aren't mutually exclusive, but at one level we've got a model of we're trying to securitise and put some capital in up front and then get it back out and roll it round. And then the other end, I think one of the outputs of COP28 was the need for concessional finance and how we effectively bridge a gap where we need 80 million to do something, but there's only 60 that's really viable, so we've got to go and fund the 20, and either we have to let the country off existing debt it has to create the fiscal room, or we have to redirect money, or we have to help them get tax, or we just have to subsidise that to make it happen. I mean, those are fundamentally different models, aren't they? One thinks you can make it viable, the other just says we need to do it and it isn't going to be viable. I mean, where are we on those two? Do they exist at the same time in different places, or actually do we need to be looking at more the concessional route really than the first one?
I mean, from our perspective as Bond and our members, we need an awful lot more concessional financing if we're going to meet the SDGs, and there is a wide body of evidence that suggests that, both on the kind of leaving no one behind, poverty reduction agenda, and certainly on the climate agenda. And many of our members also, from a kind of justice perspective, talking about concessional financing for climate, given that actually low-income countries didn't cause a lot of the problems and are then having to make the investments and deal with the impact. So our perspective is very much that we need significantly more concessional finance. We obviously are calling for a return to 0.7 as immediately, and also options to explore other sources of concessional financing for countries. So I think My view is that sometimes we have these conversations, there's a sort of ideal conversations, what does the evidence tell us is actually really needed, and then you've got the kind of reality of how much money is actually available. And I think that's sometimes where we get tied up in knots. But, you know, from a needs perspective, we need to massively scale up concessional grant financing for poverty reduction and climate purposes. I don't know if others want to add on that.
I mean, maybe just briefly on the climate. I mean, I think climate finance is going through a similar debate journey that development finance has been through to some extent on the we need a lot of money, we need to mobilise it. I suppose it's a little bit different in that a lot of that money needs to go to middle income countries to help with the low carbon transition, where, you know, capital markets are more developed, there's greater resources and private investment, and I think there's an argument being made that some concessional lending there could be important in unlocking renewables, and so I think that makes some more sense. That's a distinction, I think, from the SDGs and ODA, which is much more about the low income countries where energy footprints are not very large at all.
Thank you.
I really appreciate this and really appreciate the first panel as well. You've given us a lot to think about, and more importantly, a lot to get the Minister to think about. So thank you for sharing. Order. This session is now closed.
Ended.